In this class we want to talk about macroeconomic policy and also the instruments and targets of macroeconomic policy. Now, macroeconomic policy, you will remember, applies to the whole economy. We're talking here in aggregates. And this treatment I'm going to go through is a blend of modern thinking about the economy and the control of the economy, and also the more traditional theories from the past, Keynesian-based theories. I'll indicate as I go through what we should be looking at in more detail, and there are also supplementary videos available on the course that look at these issues as well. So for a start, let's look at the objectives of policy. Now, a famous government committee in the UK called the Radcliffe Committee reported in 1959, and reported on the objectives of macroeconomic policy. Now, bear in mind that in 1959, Keynesianism, the work of John Maynard Keynes, so Keynesianism ruled the roost. Governments throughout the world were following Keynesian economics. Keynes had published his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, in 1936, and at the end of the Second World War in 1945, more or less the whole world turned over to Keynesianism. It became an extremely popular way of looking at macroeconomics, and policies were therefore developed which would be applicable under Keynesian regimes. And the Radcliffe Committee was obviously a part of this, so they listed out what they saw to be the objectives of macroeconomic policy, bearing in mind the wave and importance of Keynesianism at the time. Keynesianism eventually started to break down, difficult to put a date on it, but somewhere in the 1970s, when there was very high rates of inflation in many countries and a lot of social unrest by the trade unions because there was controls on wages and on prices and so on, and it was felt that Keynesianism had run its course. The true reason as to why Keynesianism came apart, it's again difficult to say, but one very simplistic explanation, and probably overly simplistic explanation, was that pay negotiators had changed from negotiating in nominal terms to negotiating in real terms. Now, by nominal I mean trade unions would argue for an increase in, let's say, in wages of so many pounds per week, or in dollars, so many dollars per week, or pretty much dollars per month, or whatever. So they were negotiating for currency. They were negotiating for, if you like, pieces of paper. They wanted more money. They were not making reference to what the money could buy. And that changed somewhere in the 1990s, and the trade unions then started to negotiate in percentages. They knew what the rate of inflation was, and they negotiated in percentages. Keynes said that the labour force suffered from what he called money illusion. That they did not make a link between wages and buying power. So in a sense, Keynesianism could continue as long as that ignorance on the part of organised labour persisted. But organised labour learnt that there was a link between what people receive and what they could purchase, and so they started to negotiate in real terms, and that was one explanation for the downfall of Keynesianism. But the Radcliffe Committee, the one we've got on the slide here at the moment, that was very much imbued by the principles of Keynesianism. So let's look at what the Radcliffe Committee considered to be the objectives of macroeconomic policy. Full employment. Well, it almost goes without saying that governments aspire to full employment. It's maybe just political rhetoric on the part of many governments, because they know full well that they can't get full employment. It's very difficult to achieve. but they can't come out and say openly, because it would be political suicide if they came out and said, no, we're not aiming at full employment, we're aiming at less. So we want them to say they're aiming at full employment. And that was one of the policy targets that Radcliffe felt that the economic system should try to achieve: full employment, however it's defined. Also, stable prices. There shouldn't be inflation, or there should be very low levels of inflation. It should have a high rate of economic growth, because we like to be better off year on year. We like to have more to spend year on year. There should be a balance, or an equilibrium, in the balance of payments. Imports should equal exports in value terms. And also some sort of redistribution of income and wealth. It was felt that it would be divisive to have some very, very rich people, but few of them, and a lot of very poor people. So there should be some policy about redistributing incomes and wealth. Now, if we go back to the first one, full employment, this was never understood to mean zero registered unemployed. The Beveridge report in the UK, which was published in 1944, it accepted a 3% rate of unemployment. Difficult to say now. Back then it was about 500,000 people out of work. It's no longer the case. We don't have these targets anymore. But the point we're trying to make here is that full employment was never really promoted to mean full employment. It meant an acceptable level of employment, or an acceptable level of unemployment, I should say, one that was ideally very low. What do we mean by low? Well, it's what politicians would accept. Stable prices, around 2.5%. The target today appears to be a rate of inflation less than that of our major trading partners. That's what we normally judge to be acceptable. If our major trading partners have a certain rate of inflation, then we want less, because that will enable us to trade more effectively with them. So stable prices doesn't mean no inflation. It means a very low level of inflation. Economic growth leads to higher living standards. As we get more output, we are able to consume more, and we have a better standard of living. We have higher consumption expenditure. However, economic growth may damage the environment through pollution, and there is a big debate about economic growth versus the environment. So we want more cars, but more cars means more pollution. We want more consumer goods, but that also means drawing on the Earth's resources. And bearing in mind we live on a little planet that's flying around the local star, that's all we've got. We've only got planet Earth. So if we all want more, and the population is rising dramatically on the planet, then we have got a problem about sustainable economic growth. Equilibrium on the balance of payments. Well, to avoid international debt through a deficit, and also to avoid building up stocks of other people's currencies through a surplus. This is a long-run problem, but if we have a deficit on the balance of payments, that means we have to find other people's currencies to pay for the debts, to pay for our imports. And the way we find other people's currencies is by selling our own, which means the exchange rate will fall. Now, this may correct the situation, because a fall in the exchange rate means imports become more expensive, exports become cheaper, so it may stop the deficit. But if it's a fixed exchange rate, which it was in the past, then there would be a real problem for the government. Nowadays we have the exchange rate is a price, and it floats up and down. So it, in a sense, self-corrects. But we don't also want a long-term surplus on the balance of payments, because that would mean we're just simply building up stocks of other people's currencies. Well, we're giving them real goods. We're exporting, let's say, cars, and they're giving us their currency. Well, that doesn't seem right in the long run. They're getting cars to drive around in, and we're getting piles of their currency. So we need some sort of balance. The redistributive part, well, this was not heavily emphasized because of conflicts in the objectives. Governments have been unable to achieve all targets simultaneously. There are issues about these objectives, the ones set out by Radcliffe. There are contradictions and conflicts between them. For example, full employment and stable prices. If we try to get full employment, get the level of unemployment down, then it may trigger off higher rates of inflation. So we have got problems with these. But this was held to be the objectives of government. This is held to be what governments aspire to. And they were written up in this committee. So we have these objectives. They're more historic now than perhaps real. And governments don't tend to emphasize full employment. And when we talk about economic growth, we talk about sustainability, and we talk about green policies and so on. So a lot of this has been tempered by what's happened between 1959 and now. So the instruments of policy. The instruments of policy, well, if market forces automatically led to full employment with stable prices and rapid economic growth, then the government would not need to intervene in the economy. So if the market did it, then we would not need the government to intervene. But we do need the government to intervene. That seems to be the outcome, that the economic system does not generate full employment. Now, of course, there are some economists, say the classical economists, the economists that predated Keynes, who would say, well, it doesn't achieve full employment because of rigidities in the system, rigidities in the economy. For example, wages are rigid. Wages can increase, but we don't like wages to decrease. At least not nominal wage, not money wages. Real wages may be eroded because of the impact of inflation. Governments only intervene if they believe that market forces will not bring about the desired objectives or take too long to work. So governments will first of all examine the situation to see if the market can bring about a solution. If it does, then the government should stay out. But if it believes that the market will work, but it will work very slowly, or it may not bring about exactly the outcomes required, then the government may intervene to try and regulate what's happening. The danger with government intervention is that sometimes governments don't know all of the facts. They can't do. And certainly governments can't see the future. So sometimes intervention may be counterproductive. It may be, in fact, downright dangerous. It could be misplaced entirely and lead to dangerous or false or wrong outcomes. The policy instruments available to governments are fiscal policy, government spending and taxation; monetary policy, changes in the rate of interest and in the money supply. Now this is an old one, prices and incomes policy. It's no longer used, but I mention it here because it was used in the past, and as a policy it had a lot of issues back in right back to the 1960s, particularly in the UK, It was very controversial. The government intervened to try and control people's wages and thereby control inflation. But it led to a high level of dissatisfaction with the government, a lot of protest, a lot of disputes, social conflict, and also the government tried to regulate prices. Well, that's a direct intervention in the market system to try and control prices. That can distort the market in so many ways. So I just mention it here because it was a policy measure that was pursued in the past. Exchange rate policy was also something that was used extensively in the past. In the past, from the time of 1944 onwards, there was a fixed exchange rate system throughout the world. It was believed that fixed exchange rates would give certainty to international trade and would promote international trade, because people could draw contracts, importers and exporters, and they knew exactly what the exchange rate would be, or within a very small range they knew what the exchange rate would be. It eventually collapsed because exchange rates became difficult to hold, because there were different rates of inflation around the world, different rates of economic growth. So the exchange rates needed to be changed against each other, and eventually the whole system collapsed in the 1970s, and we moved to a floating exchange rate. Sometimes it's called a dirty float because central banks and governments intervene periodically to regulate the fall of the currency, to make sure it floats downwards gently rather than like a brick. Or if it's floating upwards, to regulate its flow upwards. Sometimes governments intervene. It's called a dirty float. But the point is that exchange rates became flexible. So the exchange rate is like the price of anything else. It's determined on the date, determined through the forces of supply and demand in the foreign exchange markets. I mentioned commercial policy at the end of number 4 here. Well, commercial policy is another way of talking about trade policy. It was the use of tariffs and trade barriers and quota systems for imports. And a tariff is just a tax on imports, by the way. Sometimes governments try to regulate imports. It seems to fly in the face of what we study in economics sometimes. We know the theory of comparative advantage tells us that international trade is a good thing. Countries should specialize in what they produce best and export the surplus in exchange for goods produced by other countries who are good at other things, and so on. And in this way the whole world benefits from international trade. But because governments sometimes want to protect particular sectors of their economy, perhaps the so-called infant industry argument, they want to protect new industry, or they want to protect strategic industry, perhaps defense industries, they engage in blocking trade. International institutions came into existence to try and fight this. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is known as GATT, came into existence to try and remove the obstacles to trade. Let's talk about fiscal policy for a moment. Using both government spending and taxation to influence the composition and level of aggregate demand in the economy. Well, that's the nature of fiscal policy. That's what fiscal policy is. It's using government expenditure and taxation to try and influence the level of demand. Why should they want to influence the level of demand? Well, under the Keynesian system, Keynes believed that if the level of aggregate demand, the total level of demand in the economy increased, then people would have more money to spend, more income to spend. They would buy more goods and services. There would be a greater demand for the goods and services, and hence a greater demand for workers and employees to make those goods and services. industry would benefit, and there could be what's known as a multiplier effect. The people who are taken on to produce the extra goods and services because the level of demand in the economy is increased, they will then have incomes to spend, and they will spend their incomes on goods and services, and so even more companies may come into existence. That's known as the multiplier effect. So the government has control over what it spends. Well, it should have at least some control over what it spends. It may not have entire control over what it spends, because many items of expenditure are pledges made through political parties or services that we deem to be important. For example, expenditure on education or expenditure on health or on the roads, or there are certain items which seem to be needed, and the government has got little discretion about their provision. But governments have got some discretion over some items, so they can say what the level of government spending should be, and also the level of taxation. Now, the total expenditure in the economy, the total level of income in the economy, is known as Y. That's another way of writing GNP, gross national product. It's Y. Y is the total level of income, national income. It's Y because John Maynard Keynes called the level of national income Y, and that's the reason why it's called Y. It's stuck. So in economics, when we see Y, we mean income. So Y is equal to E. E is aggregate expenditure, the total level of expenditure, which is equal to C. C is consumer expenditure, aggregate consumer expenditure, what we all spend, plus I. I is aggregate investment, what all the companies spend on new capital goods and additions to stocks. So new capital goods, not on existing capital goods which are bought and sold in the second-hand market. They have to be new capital goods, otherwise we'd have double counting. G is government expenditure, it's what the government spends. And X is for exports. X is what foreigners spend on, let's say, British goods, or on the goods of the country we're talking about. So X is export earnings. And of course all of that is less, we'd have to take away the amount of savings, plus the amount of tax that we pay to the government, plus the amount of imports. So that's our macroeconomic equation. E is equal to C plus I plus G plus X, minus what's known as the leakages out of the system. Now a fiscal balance is equal to G minus T. It's government expenditure minus taxation. That's the fiscal balance. So if it's positive, it means G is if it's a fiscal balance which is in positive area, it means that the taxation revenue exceeds the government expending. And a fiscal deficit will be the other way around. We're spending more than we're taking in. Now, let's say we increase fiscal deficit. So we increase G, or if you like, we reduce T. So we're going to increase the fiscal deficit. So we're going to increase G. We're going to increase government expenditure, leading to the deficit. It means we're going to spend more than we're taking in. And we can only do this because the government can borrow to plug the difference. But if it does that, then what's known as the PSBR, the public sector borrowing requirement, will increase. So there will be more debt, which will have to be paid back sometime. In future generations will have to pay it back. So the existing generation may have a good time, but future generations will have higher taxes because they're going to have to pay back the debt. But also, there's an issue here. If the government increases its expenditure, this could what's known as crowd out private sector investment. the government is taking resources, it's borrowing the resources of the banks, which would have been lent to the private sector. So G is increased, but I could fall. So aggregate expenditure may not move that much. That's known as the crowding out effect. But if we have an increase in G, we have an increase in the fiscal deficit, then incomes should increase. If the first point doesn't work, if we don't have crowding out, then incomes should increase. We have more expenditure in the economy. More expenditure means more demand for goods and services. Incomes will rise. And that also will mean more workers are required, so unemployment should be reduced. However, there may be inflation, and this is something related to what's known as the Phillips curve. We'll talk about this in separate classes, but essentially what it comes down to is that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, although some people will say there's no trade-off. There's a fixed level of unemployment, and any effort to reduce unemployment will lead to accelerating inflation. So the fact is that if unemployment falls, we may have inflationary pressures in the economy. Now, the problems with fiscal policy. Well, tax revenue is difficult to predict. It's difficult for the governments to work out exactly what's going to be received in tax revenue. The government must get the tax level or the tax rate worked out properly, because there is a relationship. It's known as the Laffer curve, L-A-F-F-E-R. Now, Laffer worked out that the government, if it has a zero tax rate, if the government sets the rate of taxes at zero, then its revenue will be zero, because it's not taxing, it's at zero. But if the government sets the tax rate at 100%, in other words, everything we earn goes to the government, then the tax revenue will also be zero, because we won't work. Why should we work and pay everything to the government? So the government's got to find the tax level which will optimize its revenue. Now, this is really tricky, because if it sets a rate at, let's say, 50%, then there might be disincentives. People may not work very hard. They may go to work, but they don't want to work too much, because they're giving half their income away to the government. So if it sets at 40%, people may work harder. So revenue may increase at 40%. There may be more incentive to work. So there are issues about revenue and the revenue that's associated with different tax levels. And of course, there's also an issue with fiscal policy that changing government expenditure, or changing taxes for that matter, are subject to time lags. They don't happen immediately. If the government decides to build more hospitals, it takes time to build hospitals. It could take years. If it's going to build a new road, it may need to have planning permission and consultation with the local communities, and there's design and engineers' reports, and that's before anything's happened, before any road is started. So there are time lags, and that means it's difficult to know when the effects of a change in fiscal policy will kick in. Now, these may have destabilizing effects. For example, a fiscal stimulus, in other words, increasing the fiscal deficit to try and stimulate the economy, to bring about more employment in the economy. If you're trying to have that fiscal stimulus during a recession, this will add to the natural recovery of the economy, because we know that economies go through cycles. This is a topic dealt in a separate video called the business cycle. But we know that economies cycle. They go through boom periods, and then it bursts and they go into recession, and the recession bottoms out and it turns up again. And it does this, in a sense, automatically. It does it itself. There are reasons behind it, which we'll deal with in other videos. But let's say the economy is in recession and the government puts in some fiscal stimulus. Now, let's say the economy is already about to enter into a positive phase. It's about to enter into recovery. But the government doesn't know this. The government sees the economy in a bad state. What it doesn't know is the economy is about to recover itself. So it adds fiscal stimulus to what is the natural recovery within the economy. And this will lead to inflation. The economy overheats. Now, if the economy overheats, the government may reverse the fiscal stimulus and take out money out of the economy. It may increase taxes and reduce its own expenditure. So it's taking out of the economy, not knowing that the economy itself is about to enter into a down period, a downward phase. So the impact of the government is to exacerbate the downward phase and make it even steeper. So governments can destabilize the economy if they don't get the timing right. So counter-cyclical policies, as they're known, ones which are meant to smooth out the cycles of the economy, these are very difficult to judge. Very difficult to get the timing right. It's very difficult to work out the extent of the intervention required. And for that reason, the use of fiscal policy could be seen as almost quite dangerous in many situations. It can, as I said earlier, it can exacerbate the natural cycles of the economy. Now, monetary policy. Well, monetary policy is aimed at monetary variables, obviously, the money supply and the rate of interest. Well, if we consider the demand for money, which comes from the private sector, but also from the public sector, but the private sector, let's say, who wishes to borrow money for, let's say, investment purposes. So there is a demand for money, and the demand for money will be at various interest rates. It will vary according to the interest rate. So there is a demand for money, we can envisage, and there is a supply of money. And the interaction between demand and supply determines the price of money, and the price of money is the rate of interest. So monetary policy is looking at the supply of money to try and regulate the rate of interest, to try and determine the rate of interest. And the government may wish to do this because it wishes to help people buy homes or reduce the cost of credit on the high street, or to reduce interest rates so people will borrow more for perhaps investment purposes. In fact, there are many rates of interest depending on risk and the time period. However, we usually take the bank base rate as representative of the rate of interest. But in fact, there are many rates of interest depending on the risk of the project and the time period under consideration. There isn't one rate of interest, there are many. But we normally take the bank base rate, which is published in the financial papers every day, and we take that as the base rate and representative of the rate of interest. Now, the rate of interest influences business borrowing and investment. Clearly, if the rate of interest is very high, then people are going to have a big return on their investment to be able to make a profit, to pay all costs, and pay high rates of interest. So high rates of interest, or interest rates in general, will have an impact on borrowing and on investment. It will also influence consumer spending, because sometimes consumers borrow to finance their consumption, particularly large items around the home, perhaps borrowing to buy a car or borrowing to buy furniture. Well, if the rate of interest is very high, they may put off those purchases, and therefore consumer spending is based partly on the rate of interest. The capital account of the balance of payments. Well, the balance of payments is divided into two parts. The current account, which are day-to-day transactions of imports and exports, but also the capital account, which represents long-term and some short-term financial flows from one country to the next. And usually fund managers who are holding vast sums of money, they are looking for the best return on their portfolios. Now, if a country increases its rate of interest, that may mean a higher return in that country vis-à-vis other countries. And given modern communications and ease of transfer of money between financial centres, the money will flow into the centre with the highest return. It's footloose. This capital can move anywhere. So it may move into a country for a short period of time, for a day, perhaps, or even less. Then it may move again to another centre who's got a different rate of interest, a higher rate of interest, and so on. Sometimes that's called arbitrage movements, and that's dealt with in a separate video as well. The money supply. Well, monetarists believe that the money supply affects the rate of inflation directly. And there's a video on the Fisher equation of exchange which discusses this. So the monetarist economists, who were very influential back in the 1970s and 1980s, they believed that the money supply was the determinant of the rate of inflation. So the Fisher equation, which was developed by Irving Fisher in 1911, that was resurrected and was promoted by famous economists, including Milton Friedman of the Chicago School, who argued that money was the key variable in determining inflation, and it was the duty of governments to control the money supply, thereby control inflation, and leave everything else to market forces. So a minimal state, reduce the size of the country, or reduce perhaps not the size of the country, but perhaps reduce the size of the government in the country. Now, exchange rates. Well, this instrument influences the balance of payments. The exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of another. So it's what we pay for our imports or we receive for our exports. Now, as I said earlier, exchange rates were fixed at the end of the Second World War. They were fixed by an agreement known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods Agreement was meant to introduce certainty, or certainly reduce risk in international trade, which would help the world recover from the devastation of the Second World War. The exchange rate was fixed in the UK until 1972 under the rules of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So exchange rates were fixed around the world, one against the other. Some countries had absolute fixed exchange rates, identical currencies but separate countries. For example, the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. The Irish government had a currency which looked like it was Irish, but in fact it was linked completely with the pound sterling. And there are many who would say, for example, a large country like the United States, there are, in a sense, 50 countries connected together with one currency. They're also within the same country, of course, but such as the size of each state, you could almost view the states individually as countries, and they've got a single currency. Well, what we know from this is that there are rich parts of America and quite poor parts of America, but they haven't got the capacity to change their currency to give them flexibility to help them to develop. because they've got a single currency. In the case of the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom, the Irish government eventually had to break the link with sterling because the inflexibility of the system was not in the interest of the Irish economy. There were different rates of economic growth, different rates of inflation, and the two economies were growing apart. The Irish economy was developing rapidly, there was more industry going to Ireland, and eventually the two countries separated. They had separate currencies. But then later on, the Irish government joined the single currency in Europe. Difficult to explain, but that should be the subject matter of a seminar perhaps, where the logic behind getting out of one fixed relationship and into another could be discussed. It could be because it's a bigger market, there's more opportunities. There are many arguments that can be made for and presumably against that move. The UK was allowed to devalue the pound in 1949 because having fixed exchange rate doesn't mean it should be fixed for all time. Situations vary across countries. As I said, different rates of inflation, different rates of economic growth, different rates of development. So eventually, stresses and strains, it's felt that the exchange rates are not properly set, or they're not set at the right level, so there can be adjustments. 1949, the UK government was allowed to change the value of the pound by 30%, and in 1967 by 14%. This is because there were large deficits on the balance of payments, and it was felt in 1967, for example, that cutting the exchange rate would thereby make imports more expensive, exports cheaper, and would enable the country to solve the deficits on the balance of payments. Since 1972, the pound has floated against other currencies. Its level determined by market forces. The Bank of England reserves the right to intervene in the market, and hence we say we have a dirty float or a managed float. So in the early 70s it was felt that the Bretton Woods system was too rigid and too many countries were having problems, so eventually it just disintegrated, and countries start to float their currency one against the other, and that's what we've lived with since. With the exception of the euro, where many countries have come together and completely linked their currencies rigidly one against the other. And that's the subject. That should be the subject matter of a separate topic. Now, the exchange rate. Well, the exchange rate influences imports and exports. We've said this many times throughout this video. A lower exchange rate will increase the price of imports and decrease the price of exports, and thus improve the balance of payments. Now, this is assuming that something called the Marshall-Lerner condition is met. The Marshall-Lerner condition simply states that if import prices increase, then there will be less imports. That means that people will be price sensitive and they will buy less imports. It could be that the exchange rate falls, price of imports becomes more expensive, and people continue to buy them because they believe that they are important for them, for their lifestyle or for whatever reason. So there has to be an adjustment. If the exchange rate falls and the price of imports rises, it may mean the situation gets worse, not better, because people will simply continue to buy the imports, paying the higher price. Likewise for exports. Exports become cheaper, but that must mean, or presumably means, that the government want foreigners to buy more exports. Well, they may not. The goods may be seen as cheaper, but that may flag up to the foreign buyers that these goods are inferior, or there's something wrong with the goods, or they don't like the goods, or whatever, changes in tastes. And this is known as the Marshall-Lerner condition. It simply states that, in our case, it states that when there is an adjustment, the exchange rate, let's say, falls and imports increases in price, it's assumed that we buy less imports. And it's also assumed that foreigners will buy more exports. And if that happens, then the Marshall-Lerner condition is met. A lower exchange rate may increase inflation through higher prices of imported raw materials and foodstuffs. So when the exchange rate falls, we have a problem, perhaps, that we import raw materials. Well, the price of raw materials will increase because it's an import. And if the price of raw materials increases, that will be fed into the production system. The price of goods produced will be more expensive, and it may be difficult to export those goods. So it's not clear what's going to happen if an exchange rate moves. Import controls, well, it's a policy instrument affecting the balance of payments. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, does not allow for an increase in import controls. Countries sign agreements to reduce import controls, and therefore they can't go back on this. So the movement is to have less import controls and more international trade. Of course, import controls may provoke retaliation by other countries. If one country decides it's going to block the imports from another country, then the other country may block the exports of the first country. So it just means international trade will become less and less, which means we'll lose the advantages of international trade. Government objectives often conflict. The objective of lower inflation has led to higher unemployment. Now, sometimes it's the case that, let's say, there's lower inflation in a country, there should be more exports. But that may not manifest itself if what we talked about earlier in terms of the Marshall-Lerner condition is not met. So sometimes we have conflicting objectives in macroeconomics. The rate of interest. Well, higher rates of interest will reduce inflation but deter investment, and also hence economic growth, and thereby reduce prosperity. So higher rates of interest can reduce inflation because higher rates of interest means there is less money supply. Less money supply, the Fisher equation of exchange, less money supply, less inflation. So higher rates of interest lead to less inflation. But higher rates of interest can also deter investment. Less investment, less economic growth. Less economic growth, less prosperity. So the idea is to have more prosperity, not less. The instruments of policy instruments are not independent. Monetary and fiscal policy are related. A reduction in the money supply will increase the rate of interest. Well, that's a monetary phenomenon. So a reduction in the money supply will increase the rate of interest, which will reduce investment, or could reduce investment. A reduction in investment could lead to an increase in unemployment because less people are needed because there's less investment, and a decrease in tax revenue. And thereby increase government expenditure. So an increase in unemployment decreases tax revenue and increases government expenditure in employment benefits. So the monetary and real economies, the fiscal economy, are linked. Now, the theory of economic policy. Now, this is broadly based on Keynesianism, which, as I said, has died away. But I think it's important to go back and look at some of the sophistication and some of the thinking that was behind Keynesianism. Keynesianism was a very sophisticated system. It used a lot of mathematical type reasoning to try and figure out what was happening in the economy. There were models and theories and a lot of prediction and calculations. There were many instruments of policy. We talked about them earlier: fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy. But there were others: training policy, industrial policy, and so on. And there were the objectives, as we talked about right at the start, the Radcliffe ones: no inflation, no unemployment, and so on. So it's trying to meet all of these requirements using the policy instruments that are available. And that's what I want to look at here. They don't necessarily apply anymore, but it's worth looking at how economists went about trying to reconcile these in the past. Now, the approach of Tinbergen, for example, as developed by Mundell, Robert Mundell, in 1962, this is a fixed target approach. In other words, the government fixes on some targets it wants to achieve and tries to achieve those. Now, the Tinbergen rule was that the number of instruments must equal the number of objectives. So if the government wants to get low inflation, low unemployment, high rate of economic growth, and balance of payments equilibrium, that's 4. So it needs 4 instruments to achieve those. So it's quite a sophisticated approach. If it had 3 objectives, it would need 3 instruments. Now, the instruments could be monetary policy, fiscal policy, as I said. These could be instruments. The objectives: low inflation, no unemployment, high rate of economic growth, balance of payments equilibrium. So it was a question of having a number of instruments and a number of targets, and they must equal. The objectives or the targets must equal the number of instruments. As I said, quite a sophisticated treatment of economic policy, a very mechanistic treatment of economic policy, looking at economics almost like a machine with buttons and levers. It's a question of getting the sequence right and understanding the mechanism, how the economy worked. And this is not the policy we've got today. Today it's much more the economy functions and there's greater reliability on market forces and privatization, deregulation, moving the government out of the economy, leaving it to the private sector to adjust. But back then it was a very hands-on approach by government. There's also a satisficing approach. Both Tinbergen and Thiel approaches suggest that the economy is fine-tuned, i.e. the instruments are continually manipulated to achieve objectives. So it meant that the government was constantly involved in the economy, trying to regulate the economy, trying to fine-tune the economy to bring about exactly no unemployment or very low levels of unemployment, very low levels of inflation. The government was tweaking it. It's not the way we see it now. What we see now is the government stands back as much as possible and allows market forces to rule. But back then it was very much hands-on. Moseley in 1976 argued that in practice policy instruments are periodically manipulated, usually all at once and usually in response to a crisis. So when a crisis arose, then all the fine tuning, of course, would vanish, and the government would have to take immediate remedial action. And sometimes economies were knocked off because of what's known as exogenous shocks. An exogenous shock could be something happens outside of the control of the government. Two countries go to war, which affects exports from a third country. Or there's a disastrous climatic change in some area, and hurricanes destroy the economy or whatever. These are exogenous. They're outside of the control of the government. Mosley proposed a satisficing theory. The policymakers, one whose motive is not to achieve the best possible states at all times, but to achieve satisfactory levels of performance. So Mosley was sort of saying, well, the government shouldn't try to fine-tune. They should try to just move it in the right direction. But you can see how interventionist this was compared to today. Today, the government makes an announcement about what corporation tax will be for the next, say, 3 years, and then leaves it at that. It doesn't fine-tune. It doesn't come back every 6 months and try to regulate it, to try and fine-tune it, to bring about the best solution. Because there's probably greater understanding nowadays that economies don't function like that. The satisfactory levels are determined by compromise, bargaining between the cabinet, the government cabinet that is, the Treasury and the Bank of England. So satisfactory outcomes and satisfactory interventions were agreed between, at that time, the main players being the government, the cabinet, in other words, the senior government, the Treasury, who looked after the economy, the department looks after the economy in the UK, and the Bank of England. And they would all try to agree what should be done. The reason I give these slides is because it's a contrast. This is very much hands-on, tweaking the economy, constant intervention, constant manipulation of the economy. As I said, using the Keynesian approach to almost see the economy like a machine with buttons and levers, and trying to maneuver the machine to where they wanted it. And that's different to now. Now we recognize that market forces will determine what goods and services are produced. The government looks after the public sector, but the private sector is seen as the engine of the economy that provides the resources, and it has to be left alone to its own devices. A good climate within which business can operate and flourish is developed. Monetarist and supply side economics. Well, this is aimed at output responsiveness of the economy. It's looking at the output responsiveness of the economy to any changes. Monetarists believe that output and employment are supply determined, as opposed to Keynesians who believe that they are demand determined. The Keynesians believe that by adjusting the level of aggregate demand that we saw earlier in this session, by adjusting that they could regulate the amount that people bought, which would in turn determine the amount of employment. So demand determined the supply in the economy and the amount of employment. The monetarists are totally the opposite. They believe that employment and supply are determined by the existence of businesses, and the role of the government is not to influence demand, but instead to create the climate within which businesses can develop. So by having low taxation, by having the end of bureaucracies and end of government intervention and regulations, and liberalising the labour market and liberalising the relationships that exist between organisations. For example, allowing the private sector, I should say, to negotiate with the unions, because the union is selling a commodity or an item of production, labour. I know it's a bad way of expressing about labour, but that's the way it is. This is something that's needed by industry, and the unions have a right to try and negotiate the best terms. So monetarism is not against the trade unions, but the trade unions, on the other hand, should be flexible and understand the conditions of the economy and the conditions that the business is operating in. If the unions force higher pay awards for their members, they can cause the members to be made redundant. But they cannot cause inflation. Inflation is caused by the money supply. That was determined by the Fisher equation. So monetarists believe that it's the output side of the economy, it's the supply side of the economy that's all important. Welfare payments encourage people to spend a long time searching for employment, more than they would otherwise. So they're perhaps not condoning a lot of welfare payments, because people should take jobs and move from one job to the next, not enter periods of unemployment whilst looking for other work. Unemployment is higher. Also, welfare payments discourage the unemployed from taking up low-paid jobs. If someone receives, let's say, £100, just take perhaps a totally unrealistic figure, but let's say somebody receives £100 in welfare payments a week. Now, if the only jobs available pay £120 a week, then that means that these people would work for £20, because they're guaranteed to get 100 off the government. So if by working they can get 120, they're only working for £20. So they're doing a full week's work for £20. So many people may think that's not worthwhile. So the impact of welfare payments may, according to this view, distort the labour market. Now, of course, what should be done about welfare payments? Because sometimes people need welfare payments to keep their family, and they genuinely can't get jobs. So there's a big issue, a big debate that's going on about this one. The loss of benefits may mean a tax rate in excess of 100%. This is known as the unemployment or poverty trap. That's the problem. If people are receiving benefits of, let's say, 100, and let's say the only jobs available pay 90, if they take the job at 90, they're losing 10. That's in effect a tax rate in excess of 100%. The government is constantly introducing schemes to overcome this problem. But it's always a problem on the part of governments to try and find the right approach and the right combination of policies and adjusting the figures and so on, to try and overcome issues such as this one. Taxation can affect the supply of labour and also the level of output through disincentive effects. If people are heavily taxed, they don't want to work. If people pay 50% of their income in tax, they have less incentive to work. If they pay 30% in tax, they have more of an incentive to work. They're getting to keep more. Some people think going to work it's not a nice thing to do. It's much better not to have to work. So having to go to work is a chore. But having to go to work and then see half the reward for working to be taxed away hurts. and therefore they don't like it. So taxation can be a major disincentive to work. Labour may price itself out of the market. It could be the case that labour demands so much salary or wages that companies close down or relocate overseas. In an age of globalization, the company seeks workers who don't demand as much elsewhere. So if we take higher wages and salaries, well, that could lead to higher prices. Higher prices means lower sales. Lower sales means less revenue for the business, which is less profit. And less profit means redundancies or close down. So simply by having higher wages may lead to redundancies. And the company may, as I said, relocate to a different market. High levels of taxation may lead to a substantial informal or black economy. When taxation is very high, sometimes people try to work and not pay tax. It's illegal, it's wrong, but it happens. Sometimes, let's say you take your car to be mended, and they will give you perhaps the price, the official price, which will include taxes, or they'll say, well, we can do it at this price and no taxes. Pay us in cash. And that's what's sometimes known as the informal or the black economy. It's not seen. The government doesn't see it. The government knows it's happening, but it happens more when taxation is high. But of course, this means that unemployment figures look worse than they actually are as well. Because sometimes people are working, but not declaring themselves to be working because they don't want to pay the tax. So some people are working and perhaps declaring themselves as unemployed, but in fact they're working. It's illegal, it's wrong, it's morally wrong, but it can happen. And it happens more when taxes are high. So according to the monetarists, they should liberalise markets where possible, especially exchange control, not having exchange control on money flowing in or out of the country, and they should have liberalised pay systems, prices, and also on dividends. In other words, these should be determined by market forces. They should not be controlled, and that's part of the monetarist view. Now this class has been long and also quite complicated. It's important that you go back over the class when you have a chance, slow it down, stop it, certainly have a few breaks throughout, and come back to it and view it again. It's essential that you make notes about the various points and link these notes to the materials in other videos and in some of the reading materials that are supplied, so that you get an overall picture of what these concepts mean and what economic policy is about, and also be able to distinguish monetarism from Keynesianism, and what are the attributes of monetarism, what are the key ideas and theories behind it, and look at all of the issues that are dealt with. Some of the slides in here I put in because they are simply illustrative of the type of complexity that perhaps Keynesianism had compared to the apparent simplicity of the monetarist system. But look over those slides as well. I'm referring here to the Tinbergen slides earlier on. But look over all of the slides and make your own notes, and pad out your notes from other videos and other sources. But that's all we're going to deal with in this session, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.